Hudor, Gay, Poor, Ire. Long ago, Greek philosophers believed that all matter was made from one single primordial substance. Then, everything changed when Empedocles proposed 4 elements that made up matter: water, earth, fire, and air. 100 years passed and Aristotle theorized a new element, an air-like substance called ether. And although these philosophers lived more than 2,000 years ago, their ideas about the elements changed the world. Hey friends, welcome back. We are here once again to talk about the history of the 4 elements, fire, earth, water, and air, and their place in classical antiquity. In particular, Alan has asked us how these 4 elements were used in ritual magic. Well, after 2 episodes of obscure philosophy and theories about triangles and how things move in a circle, we are finally here. Today we're talking about magic and other related esoteric disciplines, and in particular we are focusing on the Hellenistic period. And as I've been saying in the other videos that I've done on this topic, the bibliography is huge. There's a ton of sources that I was looking at and that I think might be useful if you want to dive into this topic a little bit further. So check out the description for the link to that bibliography because it is super long and definitely worth looking at if this is a topic that interests you. By this point in history, the 4 elements are well established and we have seen them in action, and we've seen lots of philosophers trying to figure out how the 4 elements work, how they move, what they're made of, and how they construct the universe. And now that we have thought about all of these ideas, now we get to put them into practice, which is super fun. So today's video is primarily going to be about the practical application of these elemental principles as they show up in different esoteric traditions. For the most part, we will be sticking to the Hellenistic period in Egypt, although I will jump ahead a little bit, and I'll try to indicate when I do so, because a lot of the ideas that really get their start in the Hellenistic period, that kind of take root in the Hellenistic period, such as astrology, tend to grow and expand throughout the centuries. So there is some throughput into future eras that we are not going to cover in detail. So let's set the scene for that. The Hellenistic period begins with the conquests of Alexander the Great. Alexander dies, and his successors set themselves up to rule over parts of the massive empire that he left behind. One of these successor kings, a guy named Ptolemy, gives his name to what we call the Ptolemaic dynasty, the last dynasty of pharaohs in Egypt. So Ptolemy, this Macedonian Greek, is the first pharaoh in this dynasty, and he rules over Egypt as its pharaoh. Cleopatra is the last pharaoh in this dynasty. The capital of Ptolemy's pharaonic empire is at Alexandria, which by this point was already a wealthy melting pot. It now has become the premier academic center in the Mediterranean world under Ptolemy's support. So there's money to support academic lifestyles, access to more knowledge than anywhere else in their known world. They're in close proximity to other academics of all ages and backgrounds. So really, Alexandria is a top center for scholarship. In addition to that, the close proximity that they would have had to ancient Egyptian religion not to mention bumping shoulders with other religious groups like Jews from the diaspora. This also means that they had an exposure to the strong esoteric and magical practices of those cultures. And as advancements in physics, astronomy, ethics, and metaphysics thrive in this kind of intellectual haven, so too do the increasingly formalized and systematized theories of magic, of mystery cults, and the burgeoning field of Hellenistic astrology. Magic, magical practice, and magical practitioners are notoriously hard to define in any era, but in particular in the field of classics, it is always a topic of debate. But if we think about magic as a kind of practice of using materials that you find in the natural world around you to bring about some kind of change or desired outcome, then it's only natural that magical practice in antiquity would end up having an elemental component to it. Modern witchcraft practices sometimes associate the elements with different things in nature, and if you have an elemental practice, then you can use these different things in nature to represent those elements. So, for example, a lot of people will use incense to represent the element of air, candles to represent fire, crystals or dirt or salt or something to represent earth, and water, liquid in general, to represent water. But that seems to be how it works in the modern day. In antiquity, as far as I know, there was nothing like this. So the short answer is that elemental magic just wasn't a thing yet. If you remember in the first video I did on this topic, I mentioned that in religious settings, there were no necessarily fire rituals or water rituals, but you had fire as the primary mechanism for the ritual. So, say, like if you're doing a burnt offering, and likewise with the other elements, water as a purification tool, things like that. And you get something like this in the magic of antiquity. So I want to take a look at a couple of examples of magic from the Hellenistic period where I think you could make the argument for the elements, even if it's not an elemental practice as we might understand it today. And I want to start with a literary example. During the Hellenistic period, a writer named Apollonius writes an epic called the Argonautica, which is the story of Jason and his crew, the Argonauts, going all the way out to Colchis in like roughly modern-day Georgia to retrieve the Golden Fleece. And even though this is a story about Jason, it is best remembered as a story about the witch Medea. Medea as a character has existed since the time of Hesiod. She shows up in his Theogony, and we get Euripides' play, which he names after her, and we know that she has magical powers, and we know that she practices a form of witchcraft. But it isn't until the Hellenistic period, it isn't until Apollonius, that we start to actually see her magic in action. When Jason arrives in Colchis, Medea's hometown, some of the gods conspire because they know about Medea's powers. Some of the gods conspire to make her fall in love with Jason, and so she will use her powers to help him on his quest. Now, Medea practices a form of magic known as pharmakeia, and she's referred to sometimes as a pharmaca. You can hear in the word, it's related to pharmacy, and typically this kind of magic is translated as drugs, but really what it means is herbal remedies, because in fact Medea is an herbal witch. Not that we should be putting those kinds of labels on her, but she works primarily with plant magic. And her connection to plants is so strong that in later centuries, particularly Roman poets, love to call her the Thessalian witch, or the Thessalian woman. But she is not actually from Thessaly. She's from Colchis, and yet writers call her the Thessalian because Thessaly was known for its herbal magical practice. The land itself is rich in medicinal herbs, and we know from other sources that they were practicing herbal magic in that area, so Medea gets grouped into this. But in Apollonius's story, we learn that Medea actually learned her herbal magic from the goddess Hecate, and she is her priest. Now, in some traditions, they are blood relatives. I'm not going to get into the confusing family tree, but suffice it to say that Medea has this connection to the goddess, and she's a priestess of this goddess, and she learned how to perform pharmakeia from her. Now, Hecate is associated with magic and herbalism in general, so this would make sense as a connection. But I think it's also worth noting for our purposes here today that Hecate is also a chthonic deity. She is a deity of the ground and, in fact, like the underworld. So you have a chthonic deity teaching this herbal magic to a priestess, and then that priestess using it for her own purposes on Earth. Now, this is not the only type of magic that Medea does, but it is what she's best known for. So I want to look at the spell that Medea actually performs for Jason. Apollonius calls it the Charm of Prometheus, and it is primarily a protection spell. In particular, Jason is up against these fire-breathing bulls. It's kind of a long story. And so Medea provides him an herbal concoction to protect him from the flames. So the intended effect of the spell is that he actually won't be burned by the fire. So I'm going to read to you the passage where this spell comes up. So Apollonius says, "And Medea meanwhile took from the hollow casket a charm, which men say is called the charm of Prometheus. If a man should anoint his body therewithal, having first appeased the maiden, the only begotten, with sacrifice by night, surely that man could not be wounded by the stroke of bronze, nor would he flinch from blazing fire. But for that day he would prove superior both in prowess and in might. It shot up, first born when the ravening eagle on the rugged flanks of the Caucasus let drip to the earth the blood-like ichor of tortured Prometheus. And its flower appeared a cubit above the ground, in color like the Carycian crocus, rising on twin stalks. But in the earth the root was like newly cut flesh. The dark juice of it, like the sap of a mountain oak, she had gathered in a Caspian shell to make the charm withal, when she had first bathed in 7 ever-flowing streams, and had called 7 times on Brimo, nurse of youth, night-wandering Brimo of the underworld, queen among the dead, in the gloom of night clad in dusky garments. And beneath, the dark earth shook and bellowed when the Titanian root was cut, and the son of Iapetus himself groaned, his soul distraught with pain. So a charm to ward off fire, made from an herb, tied very closely with the earth element. Not just any herb, though, an herb that was formed from the blood of Prometheus, ancient Greece's primary fire deity, or fire titan. Medea has to go out, find the plant, and collect the sap from the plant, and that's what she makes the charm out of. So let's look at the directions that she gives to Jason on how to use this charm. Apollonius says, "Take heed now that I might devise help for thee. When at thy coming my father has given thee the deadly teeth from the dragon's jaws for sowing, then watch for the time when the night is parted in twain. Then bathe in the stream of the tireless river, and alone, apart from others, clad in dusky raiment, dig a rounded pit, and therein slay a ewe and sacrifice it whole, heaping high the pyre on the very edge of the pit. And propitiate only begotten Hecate, daughter of Perses, pouring from a goblet the hive-stored labor of bees. And then, when thou hast heedfully sought the grace of the goddess, retreat from the pyre, and let neither the sound of feet drive thee to turn back, nor the baying of hounds, lest haply thou should maim all the rites, and thyself fail to return duly to thy comrades. And at dawn, steep this charm in water, strip and anoint thy body therewith as with oil. And in it there will be boundless prowess and mighty strength, and thou wilt deem thyself a match not for men, but for the immortal gods. So Medea bathes in 7 rivers. She tells Jason to bathe himself in a river. This herbal charm has to be steeped in water, and an animal has to be sacrificed on a fire. As I said, just by bumping into the natural world, the elements get incorporated into magic. But again, they're not saying it explicitly. This is not a ritual for fire and water and earth to all come together. This is just how magic was. It was closely connected with the natural world. It may sound like I'm grasping at straws here a little, and that's because I am. This is not elemental magic as we might understand it, but it is the closest that we get in literature. I want to look at a couple more examples that might get us a little bit closer to elemental magic, but the real story here is that in antiquity, elemental rituals had not become a thing yet. But let's look at some examples from the Greek magical papyri. The Greek magical papyri is a collection of individually discovered and published texts. They range from the Hellenistic period all the way up into the late antique, even maybe early medieval period, as late as the 5th century CE. So it's not a single coherent spellbook. It's not meant to be a single coherent spellbook. It's published as a collection in service, basically, of academic study. But these would have been produced and would have been circulated amongst practitioners for centuries, like I said. The rituals in the Greek magical papyri essentially have 3 different kinds of uses for the elements. The first is kind of like what we just saw in literary witchcraft, where a practitioner might be instructed to light a fire or to incorporate water or herbs or other kind of natural materials and sort of be bumping into elemental practice. But again, it's not a fire ritual, a water ritual, an earth ritual. The second kind of use is to refer to the 4 elements, or at least some of the 4 elements, along with other things. The sun and the moon, celestial and chthonic deities, deities shared from other cultures. You can get spells that are dedicated to Anubis and Hecate and Jesus Christ. I mean, it's all over the place. And in these invocations, you get the 4 elements. But to my knowledge, there isn't a spell that uses only the 4 elements in these kind of invocations. So we'll take a look at a couple of examples of that kind. And then the third kind is when fire itself represents passion. It's not like you're getting fire rituals. I'm just going to keep saying that. You're not getting fire rituals, but you are getting rituals to kindle a fire of passion in a desired partner or relationship. This last kind is pretty straightforward, but I want to look at more examples of the first 2 types that I mentioned. The first example I have for you is some kind of initiation ritual, although it's not really clear what the practitioner or the client or whoever is being initiated into. So we don't know that, but we know what the actual ritual looked like. Now, it's supposed to be performed on the banks of the Nile. I can't think of a better place to incorporate water into your magic. If you are in Egypt, I think the Nile would be the natural place to do this. So the instructions say to build a fire with olive wood for the purposes of creating an altar, and later that altar will be used to burn part of a sacrificial animal. So we have fire, just like in the ritual that Medea talks about. So the person doing the spell is actually supposed to jump into the river. They're supposed to immerse themselves and then walk backwards out of the river. This is very similar to the ritual that Medea describes to Jason. And so it's elemental in the same way that Medea's ritual is elemental. Essentially, it's not an elemental ritual, but it does incorporate parts of the natural world that we could consider elemental, and we do consider elemental today. So that's the first type. The second type, as I said, is these sort of invocations of lots of different things, including the four elements. So I've got a couple of examples of those for you. The first is a spell to establish a relationship with Helios. Helios is syncretized with the Egyptian sun god, who was all the rage, to put it lightly. The sun god is hugely important in Egyptian religion, and so in Greco-Egyptian or Greco-Roman Egyptian, Romano-Egyptian religion and magic, the sun god becomes, ever more important. And so that's how you end up with Helios being referenced in so many of these spells. So this one in particular is to establish a working relationship with Helios. Hey Helios, if you do X for me, then I will do Y for you. Things like that. It's several pages long, so I'm not going to read the whole thing, but I just want to read you this prayer portion, this invocation portion. So if you're following along with me, I'm on page 32. The invocation reads, "Come to me in your holy circuit of the Holy Spirit, founder of the world, O God of gods, Lord of the world, who have divided by your own divine spirit the universe. First from the firstborn you appeared, created carefully from water that's turbulent, who founded all the world. Abyss, earth, fire, water, air, and in turn ether and roaring rivers, red-faced moon, heaven, stars, morning stars, the whirling planets. 'Tis by your counsels they attend all things." In Egyptian cosmology, the sun god is born from these primordial waters of noon, this kind of first abyss. So the sun god is born from water, and then all of the elements are invoked, including ether, which we don't always get, so that's kind of fun. The elements don't carry much weight in this spell, they don't really do anything, but since they represent the divisions of known matter on Earth, it would make sense, I guess, to have them here if you're also calling in celestial bodies and other natural phenomena. And here's one more spell that's similar to the last one in its relationship to the elements. Now, this ritual is an immortality ritual, and as you can imagine, given the desired outcome, it is incredibly long, incredibly complex, and chock full of all sorts of really interesting things to look at. I want to focus on the very beginning of the invocation, and I'm going to read you a good chunk of it so that you can get a sense of how the elements appear in this spell. So the invocation reads, "First origin of my origins, first beginning of my beginning, spirit of spirit, the first of the spirit in me, fire given by God to my mixture of the mixtures in me, the first of the fire in me, water of water, the first of the water in me, earthly material, the first of the earthly material in me, my complete body, I," and then you supplement your name, "whose mother is," you supplement her name, "which was formed by a noble arm and an incorruptible right hand in a world without light and yet radiant, without soul and yet alive with soul. Now if it be your will, give me over to a mortal birth, and, following that, to my underlying nature, so that, after the present need which is pressing me exceedingly, I may gaze upon the immortal beginning with the immortal spirit, with the immortal water, with the most steadfast air, that I may be born again in thought, and the sacred spirit may breathe in me, so that I may wonder at the sacred fire, that I may gaze upon the unfathomable awesome water of the dawn, and the vivifying and encircling ether may hear me. For today I am about to behold with immortal eyes." And it goes on from there for several more pages. This is such a juicy spell. There's so much happening here. But you see the elements show up, ether proudly among them. First primordial waters, first primordial fires, and primordial earthly materials. Air, breath, ether. Here they are, and there are more spells like this that reference the elements in this way. Magic at this time was really about throwing everything at the wall and seeing what sticks. The elements, I think, have their role to play in these spells as part of a set of forces and beings that you could draw on in order to bring about the desired effect. We don't see them being operative in the spells. We don't see them being incorporated in the way that they would be incorporated, say, into a Wiccan casting a circle with the 4 elements, or Wiccans have 5 elements. They're 5 elements, where it's kind of like the main point of the spell. They're really just there as part of this matrix of symbols and divinities and different powers that magical practitioners could use to their advantage. They show up primarily as part of a list of archetypes and ideas and symbols. So these types of rituals that show up in these spell books, in these manuals, and also in literary representations of magic, they're not elemental. The elements are more like a way for us to think about things than anything else. So I'm going to leave that aspect of magic behind us, and I'm going to turn now to something a little bit more concretely elemental, and that is Hermetic philosophy. Hermetic philosophy is an esoteric philosophy that, according to legend, was invented by a figure called Hermes Trismegistus, who is a kind of syncretized version of Hermes, the Greek god, and the Egyptian god Thoth. And Trismegistus means thrice great. So the 3 times awesome and powerful Hermes. The literature of Hermeticism is all attributed to Hermes Trismegistus, and we refer to it generally as the Corpus Hermeticum. The corpus is preserved in a few different ways, and I want to focus on one text in particular called the Kore Kosmou. This text is preserved all the way in the 5th century CE in the writings of a guy named Stebaeus, who wrote all sorts of things, Hermetic and otherwise. He preserved some of the Corpus Hermeticum for us, including this text. The Kore Kosmou is usually translated as either Virgin of the World, Maiden of the World, Maiden of the Universe, or like Pupil of the World, like the pupil of your eye. From what I understand, we don't have a super secure date for when this originally would have been written. Stebaeus preserves it in the 5th century, but more likely than not, scholars tend to agree at least that it was probably Hellenistic. And it's like a funky little dialogue between the Egyptian gods Isis and Horus. Horus is asking lots of questions about the formation of the universe and all sorts of different things, and Isis is providing him with answers, and thus providing us with answers. It's essentially a creation story with fun, spicy little details, like an all-powerful creator god creating the universe from the word. But in this dialogue, the elements are essential in creation. Shouldn't be surprising to us at this point. So this creator god brings about creation in 2 stages. In the first stage, he mixes his breath with fire, and the fire is described as knowing fire. And from this mixture, he creates souls. The second stage, he mixes water and earth together and creates physical matter. And then the souls and bodies essentially are joined together, and that's how you get beings that have souls in them. And just like in other creation stories we've seen, creation is a rough process, and it doesn't happen all at once, and things don't go right in the beginning. Usually there's a stage of badness. And so this stage of badness comes when the creator god finally gets around to creating humans, because he doesn't provide them with laws and structures and orders and stuff. So there's all sorts of violence, murder, bloodshed, and this is where the elements come in again. Hang on to your hats here, because the four elements are personified in this little treatise, and they actually approach the creator god and speak to him. So each of the four elements speaks in turn, beginning with fire. So fire, then air, then water, then earth. And for what it's worth, this is following the Platonic model of like which elements were made first and, you know, how many triangles each element has. And that's probably why they show up in this order here. So each of these elements in turn complains to the creator god about the situation on Earth and how each of them is being affected by all of the murder and the bloodshed that men are perpetrating on Earth. So fire says, I am being polluted by the burning of dead bodies. Air complains about being polluted by the product of those burnings, smoke and the fumes that are ritually impure because of the circumstances, the deadness of the bodies. Water is being polluted by washing the hands of murderers. And then earth, this is gross. Earth is polluted by, quote, soaking with the juices of their carcasses. And earth also asks to be honored more than the other elements. Although honestly, we don't get like a resolution to any of this. The long story short is that the creator god internalizes this feedback and makes changes, but doesn't actually continue the conversation with the elements, doesn't respond to the elements, just kind of takes it in stride and then fixes the problems. And so the elements are no longer being polluted in this way. We can assume. The elements do come up later in the text in a couple of different contexts. At one point, Horus is asking Isis how souls are divided by gender, and Isis says, well, it's not really the soul that divides by gender, it's the body that divides by gender, and she says that this is a result of the cosmic air in which these souls are formed and essentially the bodies in which they inhabit. So I'll read you a couple lines. Horus asks, and how are male and female souls produced? Isis says, souls, Horus, son, are of the self-same nature in themselves, in that they are from one and the same place where the Creator modeled them, nor male nor female are they. Sex is the thing of bodies, not souls. That which brings it about that some of them are stouter, some more delicate, is that cosmic air in which all things are made. Air for the soul is nothing but the body which envelops it, an element which is composed of earth and water, air and fire. And the composition of the female ones has more of wet and cold, but less of dry and warm. Accordingly, the soul which is shut in a plasm of this kind becomes relaxed and delicate, just as the contrary is to be found in case of males. For in their case there's more of dry and warm, and less of cold and wet. Wherefore the souls in bodies such as these are sturdy and more active. The argument here is essentially taking the qualities that have been assigned to the four elements, that hot, cold, wet, and dry, and applying it to masculine and feminine archetypes, energies, whatever you want to call it, yin and yang. There is some sort of recognition of like the two kinds of natures and trying to explain that with these qualities that we've seen elsewhere applied to the elements. And there's another thing in here that reminds me of Hippocrates. A little bit later, Horus is asking Isis about disease and why, when the body has some kind of like problem going on with it, the mind also loses some of its rationality and becomes troubled in itself. And Isis has an elemental explanation for this as well. So Horus asks, for what cause is it that when men still keep alive in long disease, Their rational part, their very reason and their very soul at times becomes disabled. And Isis answer made. Of living things, my son, some are made friends with fire, and some with water, some with air, and some with earth, and some with 2 or 3 of these, and some with all. And on the contrary, again, some are made enemies of fire, and some of water, some of earth, and some of air, and some of 2 of them, and some of 3, and some of all. For instance, son, the locust and all the flies flee fire. The eagle and the hawk and all flying birds flee water. Fish fears air and earth, the snake avoids the open air. Whereas snakes and all creeping things love earth. All swimming things love water. Winged things, air, of which they are the citizens, while those that fly still higher love the fire and have the habitat near it. Not that some of the animals as well do not love fire, for instance salamanders, for they even have their homes in it. It is because of one or another of the elements doth form their body's outer envelope. Each soul, accordingly, while it is in its body, is weighted and constricted by these 4. Moreover, it is natural it also should be pleased with some of them and pained with others. For this cause, then, it doth not reach the heights of its prosperity. Still, as it is divine by nature, even while wrapped up in them, it struggles and it thinks, though not such thoughts as it would think if it were set free from being bound in bodies. The argument is basically that the soul is afflicted by the things that afflict the body, and the things that afflict the body are evidently elemental. If you think back to our discussion of Hippocrates pretty early on in the series, he kind of approaches medicine in this way. The body is composed of 4 humors, so he says. Eventually, although he doesn't equate them with the elements, each of them become associated with the elements later on, and these elements have these qualities: hot, cold, wet, and dry. And if you have too much of one humor, which later will be associated with the element, then you have to counterbalance it by leaning into the opposite element, or the element with the opposite qualities. So in Hermetic philosophy, the elements are evidently really important. They're conceived of as beings that can reason, that can talk, that have concerns for their own well-being. And they also play a role in the lives of creatures on Earth, souls as they are manifested within these bodies. But the elements don't have an effect on souls themselves. They have an effect only on the bodies. But because souls are tied into the bodies for the duration of the time that they're in the bodies, the elements have like an indirect effect on souls. So that's a little bit of Hermetic philosophy for you. I'm only focusing on the one text, but I think it demonstrates the kinds of things that you can do if you have a strong consensus about these primordial building blocks of the universe, and you can do some really cool things with them. Which brings me to another branch of Hellenistic esotericism, and that is astrology. The Greeks did not invent astrology, of course, but they did produce texts of astrology during the Hellenistic period that essentially are the foundations of the Western astrological tradition as we know it today. Hellenistic astrology is kind of a mixture between the Mesopotamian tradition and the Egyptian tradition, with some Greek cultural stuff added into it. Now, there is a legendary tradition that Hellenistic astrology was invented by none other than Hermes Trismegistus, but more likely the Mesopotamian system of the 12 signs of the zodiac combined with the Egyptian system of the decans, brought together in Hellenistic horoscopic astrology, where you're casting birth charts, the signs are affecting different things, and you get the creation of the house system, which is still used in astrology today, as are the zodiac signs and as are the decans in some branches. So this is a burgeoning field in Hellenistic times. This is not a long tradition. The people who are writing astrology at this time, they're inventing Hellenistic astrology, even if they're not inventing astrology. And so a lot of things are changing. And one of the changes that you see in this period is the association of certain qualities with the planets. And when they say planets, they also include the luminaries, the sun and the moon. To a Hellenistic astrologer, everything is just called a planet. These are the same qualities that we have been talking about this whole time: hot and cold, wet and dry. And once you get this approach to astrology, this system of associating qualities with planets, and the planets now have qualities that sort of direct the effect that they have on our lives, that's when you can bring the four elements into it. So in order to suss out how Hellenistic astrology incorporated the four elements, we have to talk about two different camps. The first camp is the Stoic camp, and the second camp is the Aristotelian camp. And they're largely saying the same things with a couple of very significant differences. The Stoics and the Aristotelians agree that there are four elements, we know what they are, and that they have these qualities: hot, cold, wet, and dry. But as you can see here, the Aristotelians associate fire primarily with hot, air with wet, water with cold, and earth with dry. In this Aristotelian scheme, each element can more easily change into an element with which it shares one of these qualities. So fire can more easily turn into air because they both have hot in them, even though fire is the primary hot element. Fire can turn into earth because they're both dry. But it's harder for fire to turn into water because both of its qualities would have to change. It's not impossible, but it was more difficult. So that's Aristotle. The Stoics have these two principles that they're working with: the active principle, representing the divine, and the passive principle, which Chris Brennan very helpfully defines as the unqualified substance of matter. So this active principle, this divine principle, is what makes things, and then the passive principle is the matter with which things are made. The active principle is associated with fire and air. Fire and air have opposing tangible qualities in the Stoic schema. The passive principle is associated with water and earth, and those two elements have opposing tangible qualities. So in the Stoic scheme, fire is primarily hot, that's the same as the Aristotelians, but air is primarily cold, which means that water is primarily wet, which to me honestly makes more sense, and then earth is primarily dry, like the Aristotelians. So why does this matter to us? It seems like kind of semantics, but it matters to us because these two camps go on to inform the astrological tradition. So, for example, Claudius Ptolemy is a follower of the Stoic tradition, and he does not associate the signs of the zodiac with the four elements. Vettius Valens, on the other hand, does associate the signs of the zodiac with the four elements, and it may be the case that he is the first to do so. His work, at least from what I am hearing, from what I'm reading, is the first reference to this kind of thing that we have. And it is a hot topic in Hellenistic astrology. Not every astrologer of this time period agrees. I already told you Claudius Ptolemy does not include this in his astrological writings. The list of astrologers who don't is as long, if not longer, than the list of astrologers who do. But those who do, probably following Valens, envision a system where the 12 signs of the zodiac are divided up into 4 groups of 3. This was already in practice, and these 4 groups of 3 are exactly 120 degrees away from one another, and these are called the triplicities. Now, Valens associates these triplicities with the elements. And if you are an astrologer, or if you are dabbling in astrology, you will understand this scheme right here. The fire signs, the Pyrodes, Aries, Leo, and Sagittarius. The earth signs, the Geodes, the Geodes, Taurus, Virgo, and Capricorn. The air signs, the Aerodes, Gemini, Libra, and Aquarius. And the water signs, Cancer, Scorpio, and Pisces, the Huda Todes. So this scheme is the scheme that we still use today to describe the signs of the zodiac. The way that this shows up in Hellenistic astrology is kind of like there are literal interpretations. So you get reports of birth charts where somebody has an adverse Pisces placement and they died at sea. Or you have someone with a really strong fire placement who is quick to anger, or who, like literal interpretations, right? Like has some kind of negative interaction with fire. And then kind of slowly over time, you get more into like personality stuff where you're referring to the temperament of the person. So someone with a lot of water in their chart might be seen as emotional. Someone with a lot of fire in their chart might be seen as aggressive, and so on. And this, I think, is primarily how it shows up in astrology today, at least in my own experience and the way that I do astrology, is kind of like leaning into what I believe is a branch of astrology called like psychological astrology or something like that. We're incorporating, now that psychology is like an official academic field, it hasn't been a field for very long, incorporating that into astrology as well. So if that's something that interests you, there are 2 books that I have linked in the description by an astrologer called Darby Costello. I'm still working my way through them myself, but it's sort of just like testimonials about different charts and how the elements show up in different people's lives from an astrological standpoint, from like a psychological astrology standpoint. So if that's your jam, those books are probably the place to go. And from the Hellenistic period onward, this concept of the elements and the zodiac gets expanded out into ever more detailed aspects of astrology, like planetary joys. Again, I don't think we should be surprised here. Like basically everyone else, astrologers in antiquity were exposed to philosophy, were exposed to, especially in Alexandria, the most up-to-date theories about the world and the universe, the most up-to-date astronomy. Everything was getting really good at Alexandria. So it's not surprising to me to see the integration of these different traditions really starting to take hold here. Alright, there are a couple of loose ends that I want to tie up because I am bringing this series to a close, at least for now. And we have a few more thinkers from antiquity that I want to give a shout out to. The first is Galen, primarily known as a doctor, but also interested in philosophy and learning in general. Galen was born in Turkey sometime in the 2nd century CE, so a little bit later than what we've been talking about. He traveled around the empire. He started his medical training in healing cults, going to healing shrines and learning from the priests of Asclepius, and then later coming to Alexandria for formal medical training and eventually settling in Rome. Galen advanced the study of medicine significantly during his lifetime and affected it thereafter for literally centuries. And part of this is because he was such a prolific writer. He wrote so much. yeah, I mean, his word was taken literally as gospel, to actually the detriment of scientific advancement, because people would say, well, that can't be right because that contradicts Galen, even though they're observing it with their own eyes. Anyway, there's a lot of problems with Galen, but one thing that Galen does is he leaves behind this massive body of work. And there's one text of his that I want to bring up. It's called On the Elements According to Hippocrates. We've already talked about Hippocrates. We already know what Hippocrates says about the elements. If you need a refresher, essentially he uses the elements as an analogy for people who say that the body only has one humor in it. He says there are four humors, just like people say that there's a single primordial principle in the universe, the arche. I don't think that's true, and I don't think it's true that there's only one humor. I think there's four humors, there's four elements. We talked about that before. Now, Galen essentially is providing a commentary on this text. He is quoting liberally from it, but he's also making reference to Plato, Aristotle, other people that we know. I think Empedocles shows up. So I wanted to bring this text to your attention, not because it adds anything new necessarily to the elemental conversation, but really because it's an awesome summary of everything we've talked about on the philosophical side. It gets into this quest for the arche. It talks about, how it's impossible for there to be a single arche, and goes on to show, or at least Galen thinks that he has satisfactorily shown that there are four elements. Here's what they are and here's how they behave. So the first half is basically a summary of the Hippocrates treatise that we talked about, and then the second half is kind of like an example. He reports a conversation that he had with, I guess, like maybe a teacher of his, this guy named Athenaeus, who thought that there was an arche. And Galen showed him, and he, totally owned him with facts and logic, and he had to admit that there were four elements. So it's a great refresher if you're, still lost amongst Plato's triangles and you want to get back down to the basics of the argument. So I would recommend reading this. It's only like 25 pages. And it goes to show that even in Galen's day, we are centuries beyond Empedocles at this point, but even in Galen's day, this is still a debate, this is still a conversation that people are having, and still an argument that people are having. And Galen is feeling like he has to remind everybody what Hippocrates said and use these medical analogies and stuff to show, what he believes is the correct interpretation is these four elements. And there's lots of great examples in there. He says things like, if you would imagine the most perfect hot element, right? Because he's still talking about those qualities, hot, cold, wet, and dry. If you imagine the most perfect hot element, it's fire, right? Other things are hot. He says like beans, lentils, all sorts of stuff like hot food, hot whatever. But surely a bowl of beans is not an element, right? If you think hot element, you think fire. If you think wet element, you think water, even though wine, oil, all sorts of other things can be wet, blood. But if you ask yourself, what is the thing that most obviously and most closely represents this quality of wetness, it's going to be water. So yeah, it's a great little refresher text. I would highly recommend it. And the last guy I want to talk about in this series is a guy named Proclus, who is one of the last heads of the Platonic Academy before it gets shut down because the Roman Empire has become Christianized. So Proclus lives in the 5th century CE, and shortly after his death, the Emperor Justinian shuts down all of the philosophical schools because they were pagan schools. So Proclus comes into conflict with the religious establishment in his day. He has to leave Athens at a certain point because he gets into conflict with the Christian authorities there. He reports having a dream that Athena came to him in a dream and told him to take her statue back to his house and keep it safe because the Christians were going to destroy it. So there's a lot of religious tension going on here. But essentially, Proclus is a philosopher in the style of Plato, after Plato, what we might call Neoplatonist, which is as much religious as it is philosophical, if you want to try and make that distinction there. But by this point, philosophy had become less rigidly divided between different schools. So Proclus is very well read, and in his writings, he's super prolific. We have a lot of his stuff. In his writings, you see references that might be considered Stoic, certainly Platonic, Aristotelian, but these divisions mean less than they used to by his day, so that's not really that surprising. The text that I want to bring to your attention is a hefty text. It's a commentary that Proclus wrote on Plato's Timaeus, which is the dialogue that we talked about with the elements and the triangles and the dodecahedron. So Proclus writes a commentary on this text, and it's chunky. I've listed the English translation in the sources list, but it's like 2 volumes, it's like 1,000 pages. Proclus contributes to the conversation about elements in terms of how they move and how they might transform from one into the other, if that's at all possible. But the biggest contribution in my mind is that he applies a different system of qualities to the elements. And it just gives us a little bit more to think about. And he uses these qualities to kind of prove other things about the elements throughout, mostly in book 3. So instead of hot and cold, wet and dry, each element has 3 new qualities to it. So fire is sharp and subtle and mobile. Air is blunt and subtle and mobile. Water is blunt and dense and mobile. And earth is blunt and dense and immobile. Now we have 3 pairs of opposing qualities: sharp and blunt, subtle and dense, mobile and immobile. And as I said, he uses these qualities to describe the elements in different ways. So for example, fire is subtle, so it's primarily visible. It doesn't really have substance to it, whereas earth is primarily dense, and it has the most substance out of all of the elements. And in Proclus's scheme, fire and earth seem to be the primary elements, whereas water and air are the secondary elements. And that's because fire is primarily visible, whereas earth is primarily solid. So in his conception, things come to be as a result of the earth element, but you can only see them because of the fire element. So even though things come to be through earth, fire provides that sort of necessary component in order for matter to be perceived. So I think more than anybody else, Proclus has a focus on earth because in his mind, earth is the most solid, the most dense, and it supports the other elements. It supports water, and then water in turn supports air. Earth is literally the foundation of everything in Proclus's mind. So I wanted to bring this text to your attention, mostly for that reason, because of the new qualities that Proclus assigns to the elements, and because I think of all of the people that we've talked about, he's the only one that draws everything from fire and earth. The conversations around the 4 elements do not end with Proclus. Of course, they're still going on today. They show up all across Western culture. In alchemy, for example, the fifth element, remember Aristotle's fifth element that later comes to be called ether, that shows up in alchemical texts as the quintessence, the fifth element. And then, of course, today the four elements are everywhere. They show up in modern astrology as the spiritual successor to Hellenistic astrology. They show up in witchcraft. I've already talked about this a little bit, but there are people who are practicing what they refer to as elemental magic, where their primary focus is one or more of the elements. For example, I follow like a water priestess on Instagram. So her primary thing is water. And I've seen people who have similar relationships to, say, fire or earth. Sometimes this is informed by astrology because magic always has been and always will be a hodgepodge of different traditions, a syncretization of different schools of thought, different methodologies, different cultures. Sometimes for practitioners who work with deities, sometimes the elements are drawn into your relationship with a deity. So, like if you venerate or work with Brigid, for example, in the Celtic tradition, you might practice a form of fire magic because Brigid is associated with fire. The elements are associated with the four suits in the tarot deck in the minor arcana. So Pentacles has to do with earth, and it has to do with the material world around you. Whereas Cups is associated with water, and it has to do more with your emotional world, your interpersonal relationships. Like I said, Wiccans have 5 elements, so fire, earth, water, air, and spirit. In like New Age spirituality, different crystals are associated with different elements, usually informed by astrology, but not always. There's a lot of places that this stuff comes up in. So if you are on the lookout for the elements, you're going to start to see them everywhere. Guys, what a journey we've been on together. I learned so much in preparing these videos. The question is endless, right? Where do the 4 elements show up? The answer is everywhere. When do the elements show up? The answer is from Empedocles onward. I mean, even individual elements show up before Empedocles. This notion has captured people, and it's not going anywhere anytime soon. Like with a lot of things, we have the ancient Greeks and the ancient Romans to thank for this concept and these elemental archetypes for us to chew on in our various metaphysical endeavors. So that's about all I have for you today. I hope that you have enjoyed this series. I hope you found it useful. I would love to know your thoughts in the comments. If you like this video, you can let me know by leaving a thumbs up down below. And if you want to see more content like this, digging into different themes about belief, religion, magic, esotericism, all sorts of things in the ancient world, feel free to subscribe to the channel. That's sort of what I do here. This has been so much fun, so thank you all for watching. I truly appreciate you, and I'll see you next time.